Welcome to Buddha Stories, where strategy meets art. I'm your host, Gail Hataitham, founder of Buddha Creative Studio. In each episode, I sit down with changemakers from across Canada's nonprofit world to uncover how they achieve big results with limited resources. This podcast is here to help you share your story with more clarity, creativity, and confidence. Today, I'm joined by Kendra Horosko, Senior Communications Advisor at Calgary Health Foundation. But before she found her way into communications, Kendra's journey took her across the globe. A historian by training and a traveler at heart, she spent years living, working, and exploring throughout Europe, Asia, and South America. Along the way, she developed a deep appreciation for people, stories, and the power of connecting through shared experiences. Those experiences eventually led her to communications, where she discovered a passion for translating complex ideas into plain language and using storytelling to build understanding and connection. Today, Kendra helps bring the impact of healthcare philanthropy to life through her work at Calgary Health Foundation, an organization that raises and invests donor support to advance healthcare across Calgary and Southern Alberta. She helps connect donors and the community to the people, programs, research, and innovations that are improving patient care. In this conversation, we explore Kendra's unconventional path into communications, the art of nonprofit storytelling, and what it takes to create messages that build meaningful connections and inspire action. So let's dive in. Hi, Kendra. How are you doing today?
Good. Thank you so much for having me, Gail.
I'm so glad that we have you here with us today. The first thing I noticed about your bio is that your path wasn't exactly a straight line. You studied history, spent years living and traveling around the world, and only later found your way into communications. So looking back, was there a moment when you realized that storytelling and communication was the work that you were meant to do?
So growing up, I feel like I never really knew what I wanted to be, but I knew that I loved writing. And in grade 5, I actually had a fan club because each week we would write a story in class. My best friend Carrie and a little boy in the class named Terry were part of my fan club. So I loved writing from being young and really got into it in elementary school and knew that I wanted to do something that involves storytelling. And I remember around that time actually reading The Giver and feeling like, the idea of like passing on stories and holding memories was really appealing to me. I always felt like I wanted a job like The Giver. So I got into history. I did undergrad in Camrose at Augustana, which is now part of University of Alberta, in history. And then I went on to do a master's thesis in history at the University of Victoria. And part of that thesis was actually interviewing war brides, so British women who married Canadian soldiers and came back to Canada during the Second World War. And listening to their stories, I learned so much about people and how we're all really interconnected. And I think that really came through in a lot of the traveling that I've done as well. And I started a travel blog when I was traveling, so I did lots of writing then. And then when I came back to Calgary, I got into communications, first of all, with an architecture firm. And it was kind of my first foray into communications. And it felt like a good path because, during my thesis, I'd done so much writing and then it seemed to make sense to kind of get into this field. And I really enjoyed it. I found with the architecture firm that it wasn't I needed a little bit more values alignment. So I realized that I really wanted to make sure that the work that I was doing was giving back to the community, and I decided to get into nonprofit communications, and it really seemed to make sense for me. And that's kind of what I've been doing since 2015. So it wasn't necessarily a straight path, but I think I did end up in the right place.
Yeah, that's nice. It's like it's always in you. You just never knew until you try it.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So because you have the historian background and a lot of experience in traveling around the world, how do you think those experiences have taught you about understanding people, and how do you think it helps you with your communication work right now?
Yeah, I think everybody has a story, and I think that we all carry those experiences in a different way, and it shapes how we see the world. So I think that when you approach people with curiosity instead of assumptions, you build trust with them a lot more quickly. And I think that's something that I use every day in my work, whether I'm engaging stakeholders or supporting leaders or just generally developing communications. And that's something that has been really valuable for me. And also just recognizing that, we're all just trying. as humans. And I think, generally people are trying to be the best that they can be, and things are not black and white. People are complex. That's something that really has come out through my life, and something that I have to keep reminding myself too, because sometimes it can be easy to see things in black and white thinking. And also the importance of context. History teaches you that people's actions make a lot more sense when you understand the context that they're operating in. And travel really reinforces that, because you're encountering different cultures and values and ways of seeing the world. So I think together, these things have taught me to be slower to judge and to pause and to ask more questions. And in my work, I think that's really valuable, because communication isn't just about what you're saying, but it's understanding how different audiences will receive the message and interpret it. So I think that's been travel and history have actually been really great foundations for me to kind of build my communications career off.
That's a great reminder, because I feel like for a historian, you always kind of train to look at stories through the lens of time and context. Like when something happened at the moment, you have to look at the bigger picture to really understand what influenced those decisions that people make, right? Yeah.
For sure.
And you talk about your work, but can you explain a little bit more about what you do? There might be people that maybe not familiar with healthcare philanthropy. So can you explain to us what your work involved in, and what actually drew you into working in this area?
Yeah, for sure. And before starting at Calgary Foundation, I didn't actually really realize that healthcare wasn't completely covered by the government in Canada. And I think that's a common misconception. And I think that we've recently actually done a little social media campaign and video series where we're trying to clear up some of the misconceptions around healthcare and funding. So our CEO recently described it in a really good way in one of these little videos, where he talked about how the importance of donors when it comes to healthcare. So he said, this was the analogy, he said that government funding is the engine that keeps healthcare running every day, and philanthropy is the accelerator. So really helping us to move faster, reach further, and bring in new ideas into care sooner. So some of our most advanced care and innovative research and life-changing programs only exist thanks to donors in Calgary. So Calgary Health Foundation helps fund medical research, innovation, specialized equipment, infrastructure. We recently celebrated the new state-of-the-art endoscopy unit at Rocky View General Hospital, which was made possible thanks to donations. We are investing in a contrast-enhanced ultrasound pilot project, which is a new way to detect ovarian cancer using ultrasound, which is a lot easier to access and can really help a lot of people discover that diagnosis sooner. And then we're supporting a minimally invasive spinal endoscopy program at Foothills Medical Center. So we know traditionally spinal surgery was a large incision, a long recovery. But this ultra minimally invasive program, some patients are going home as the same day as their surgery, which is a huge shift. So these types of projects are things that we have been able to fund thanks to donors that have really supported healthcare locally. So a lot of my work is around sharing what can be invested in, but also thanking our donors and really showing the impact of the investments. So we recently have been working on our annual impact report. That's been a big part of my work. We're often telling patient stories, so either written stories, sometimes we do video interviews. Donor recognition is a really great part as well. We have lots of major donors that make substantial contributions towards projects, so creating recognition strategies around that. We have different kinds of fundraising campaigns throughout the year that I'll support with. Lots of different events. We've had a really great women's health golf tournament in June, and that happens every year. And then our women's health symposium in March. And then also internal communications, which I feel often gets kind of pushed to the back burner, but is so important. And it's kind of a joke in our organization that I'm a real stickler when it comes to grammar. So I've developed a writing style guide for the organization, a quotation bank, and then a statistics bank, just to make sure that across the organization, we're kind of telling the same story and able to make sure that everybody's aligned in how we're talking about this important work.
Yeah, thank you for that. And like you mentioned that part of it is telling patient stories, and I feel like that's really, really personal.
It is.
Right? So I'm wondering how do you choose what story to tell? How do you balance the emotional part with the authenticity part of it? And how can you approach telling these stories that in a way that feel honest and respectful and inspire people to take action?
Yeah, that's such an important part of my work. And I should say too that the reason that I kind of was really interested in getting into healthcare specifically was because I have my own story of my daughter's birth was quite traumatic. And there was a time where we didn't know if I was going to make it through. She was okay. But even having my own healthcare story and kind of reflecting back on that and all the emotion, like I can understand coming into conversations with other people, what they might be feeling as they're kind of talking about their own stories. So I think approaching it from that understanding is helpful. But then also when I sit down with somebody, kind of making sure that upfront they know that I care about their story, that we're really grateful for them participating. Making them feel like the conversation is a safe space for emotion to come through and to understand that we can all relate to a lot of these stories and a lot of this emotion. Most people do have their own kind of stories about healthcare experiences or, experiences of loved ones. And I think that the emotion in those stories really encourages people to take action and to make donations. We also want to make sure that the person feels comfortable with the finished product, whether that's a story or a video. I remember that a few years ago, we were doing an interview with somebody who he didn't want to get emotional on camera. It was a video interview. And he was talking about his own experience. And at one point he talked about he was able to see his kids grow up. And there was a moment in time where he wasn't sure that he was going to be able to do that based on the health problems that he was having. And at that point, everyone in the room got emotional, including him. But it was such a beautiful moment. And it made for a very beautiful video. And we made sure to show it to him afterwards, the finished product, and he was comfortable with it. And we actually got great engagement through that video. And I think it was because of that, emotional piece. So making sure that people feel comfortable with the finished product and then also making sure they know the impact of their participation. We did a campaign for Giving Tuesday a couple years ago that actually featured my sister and her story around her daughter's birth. And Rosie's a super cute little kid. So I think that helped us with the engagement on that side. But we had an incredibly successful Giving Tuesday that year. So we were able to invest over $150,000 towards fetal monitors thanks to that campaign. And to be able to go back to them and say, thanks to you telling your story, so many more babies will be safely born in Calgary. And to be able to say, $150,000 has been put towards this project, thanks to you telling your story, is very impactful. So I think that's a really important piece as well.
Exactly. But I'm also wondering, how do you choose what stories to tell?
So I think that Calgary Health Foundation has 3 kind of priority areas of work. So surgical innovation, cardiac care, and women's health are the 3 kind of main areas. And we really focus on those areas, but not everything falls within that. And it can also be tricky to collect stories from some of those areas. So women's health, for instance, it can be difficult, when we're talking about things like pelvic floor health. We did a story on that in our Breakthroughs magazine a couple years ago to talk about incontinence. It's kind of uncomfortable and it can be difficult for people for sure. But it's so important to tell those stories. We know that women's health has traditionally been underfunded, under-researched, under-recognized. And it's important to tell those stories so that people can recognize how they do have to invest in that. So finding the people can be a little bit difficult sometimes, but I think that once we do find those stories, really focusing on kind of the emotional side of things and letting people come through that way is really great. And we all have those healthcare stories in our lives, as we've talked about. So I think that that's important as well.
And I'm sure it's not easy for those people to be able to tell their stories to the public. It's just so personal and so emotional. But when they do, it creates such impact in the community.
And I should have also said too, we really try to be intentional with aligning kind of themes. So we work cross-departmentally. We'll work with the philanthropy team, the events team, the donor engagement team on a regular basis to make sure that everything's aligning in our content calendar. So we're looking at what are the kinds of stories that we're telling within the month and how can we kind of make sure that things are connecting or, there's synergy between stories as well. And we find that's very helpful as well.
Yeah. So healthcare can be really complex, and
Yes.
nonprofit often have limited time and resources. Like how can you decide what deserve your attention? How do you find the right things to say or the right message for the moment?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can be tricky. The content calendar does help us in that way and really trying to stay attuned with conversations that are happening live in the community, what's kind of popular, what kind of things we're seeing in the news. We're paying close attention to that. Like we know women's health has been more of a focus lately in media. So making sure that we're telling stories that kind of align with that. And yeah, bringing that emotional side in. I feel like I'm talking a lot about that, but I do feel like it's important, especially in terms of the healthcare side of things, seeing that these are really meaningful stories and also the importance of plain language. I feel like we often work with physicians, and as we're telling these stories, we want to make sure that we're telling them in a way that's accessible to all of our audiences. So it can definitely be tricky to decide which stories we're telling, but I think that, the working cross departmentally really does help with that as well.
Is there like a story or a campaign or a project that that you have done that you feel like it makes such a big difference that maybe you could share?
Yeah, sure. Past fall, we worked with Lanny McDonald on our holiday campaign, and my colleagues make fun of me because I am like not a sports fan at all. But of course, I knew who Lanny McDonald was and knew that he was a big deal. And he is so loved across Calgary. And it was just an incredibly successful campaign. So we had nearly 1,500 donors that gave a total of $550,000. And we were able to do a day of filming with Lanny at Foothills Hospital. We were able to kind of see the moment where he reconnected with the physicians that supported him during his cardiac event that he had a few years ago. And it was such a meaningful moment. And to see him get emotional on camera talking about the story was really great. And that $550,000 that we brought in through this campaign was actually matched. So we were able to invest over $1.1 million in state-of-the-art tools and technology at Foothills Medical Center to help empower medical teams to diagnose heart conditions for other people and perform minimally invasive procedures. So this was a hugely successful campaign for us, both in terms of like the money that we raised, but also the engagement. We had so many people reaching out through social media, and then also people making donations, leaving notes to say things like, "Thank you for saving Lanny." It was just a really great campaign for us. And it really felt like a good community building piece too, since Lanny is such a local legend.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think I've seen that campaign as well. So from your experience, what would be like a communications habit or misconception that you see at a nonprofit fail into again and again, the common mistakes that you have seen, and what would you rather see instead?
I think that a lot of organizations are very focused on getting information out without pausing to kind of consider their audiences and what the audiences actually need to hear or feel or do. It ends up being very organization centric communication, kind of here's what we did rather than here's why it matters to you. So I think that I'd rather see nonprofits start with listening. So before creating a campaign, kind of considering what does our audience care about? What kind of barriers do they face? What sort of action are we hoping that they'll take? And then building communications around those insights. I think that the most effective nonprofit communications are the ones that share information, but rather the ones that create the strongest connection. So when people see themselves in the story, they can understand the impact, and then engagement just becomes so much more meaningful.
Great advice and beautifully put. Thank you. And like you were saying that, there's so many trends and new things that happening all the time in the communication world. So there's always change in the nonprofit communications. Can you tell us a little bit more about like what you have seen changing over the years, and what do you think that nonprofit communicators should be paying attention to?
Yeah, sure. And I feel like I haven't been in the communications world for a terribly long time, just based on the fact that I did so much travel and kind of, took a while to get through school. But I have been, I guess, in that nonprofit space, communication space for about 13 years. And definitely in that time have seen some shifts. So I feel like a big one is around AI. It's a big conversation right now. Lots of people, lots of things to say about it. And I think kind of when I think about it, it's just like, it comes back to that black and white thinking for me. Like, it's neither all good nor all bad. I really believe it's a tool and we can kind of decide if and how we use it. And I know different organizations are approaching that differently. It's a big thing right now. I feel like it will kind of like stabilize out and people will kind of, work with it in different ways and decide what works best for them. And then I'd also say the focus on crisis communication since I started, obviously through the pandemic, brought up a lot of that. But, crisis communications is a piece that we consider throughout, let's say, like when we're building communications plans for events. I mentioned our women's health golf tournament that just happened. Built into the communications plan for that event, we also had a crisis piece in there. So what do we do if there's lightning, if there's a tornado, if a bear is on the golf course? And I think it is important that organizations are focusing on those types of things now as well, too.
Those are good points. And like you said, nothing is black and white. Like we just have to see things in context. So like you spend your careers telling stories and inspire people to care in the world where people are constantly overwhelmed with information. What is it that makes someone, in your opinion, what really makes people truly?
I think it really does come down to seeing something familiar in a story or seeing yourself in a story and that emotional piece. And I think it's a balance too between kind of like the micro and the macro. So talking about the impact that donations have on the healthcare system, but then also looking at the impact on, individuals and telling a person's story where you get down to how they felt, how this really changed their life. But then, to be able to tell that story from, this many lives were changed thanks to this donation is really important. And I think recognizing too that people are motivated by different things. So it's important to understand your audience, as we've been talking about, because, some people are donating out of a sense of altruism and they feel like it's just the right thing to do. Some people want to give back, similar to my story of having my daughter born and feeling like if I had known Calgary Health Foundation existed after coming out of the hospital, I definitely would have made a donation because I just felt so grateful that so many great healthcare staff saved my life, basically. And then some people are donating because it's kind of more of a family tradition, and we see that with some of our legacy donors. So I think the importance of understanding your audience is really, really relevant here.
Yeah, I'm sure that like working in this area has impacted you personally as well.
For
Like,
sure.
just hearing your story already really inspiring for me.
Yeah, that's
Thank
good.
you. Yeah. So before we wrap up, I'm wondering if you have any questions for me or for Kuda Creative.
Yeah, I've listened to a few of your past podcasts, and I know you've talked a little bit with some people about kind of like balance in life and kind of juggling personal life and work. And I know that we both have daughters around the same age. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about kind of your strategies for juggling life. I'm always marveling at how families seem to kind of patch together solutions and systems that work for them. But yeah, how do you balance it all?
Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. I think it's the challenge that we all do have, especially moms. So first thing I want to say that, everyone's path is different. So what works for someone might not work for someone else. So for me, as a single mom, a solopreneur and a podcast host, like every day just looks different. No 2 days is the same. But for me, my daughter is always my biggest priority. So I work around her schedule. So that means that, sometimes I work short hours. I try to squeeze in work within the hours that she's at school, or I work late after she goes to bed. That's just how I make it work for me, right? And I stop expecting to have the balance for every day because I feel like that's just not realistic. So some days I'm more of a mom, so I'm more focused on my parenting role, and some day I focus on my work role as a designer or as a podcast host. So I feel like just have to look at the balance of life of like work-life balance in a more like a broad perspective. Like, so not instead of just a single day balance, it's like a week or a month. I just try to balance it out the time that I spend with my daughter and my business. And I also have come to accept that my business and the podcast might not grow as fast as I wish to see. It's just, just how it works for me. Like, and I'm okay with that. I'm sure that you feel the same, that my daughter is not gonna want to spend as much time with me as she does now. Pretty soon she's gonna want to spend more time with her friends. So I just want to take this moment and really take it in, just spend as much time with her as possible and try not to work when she's with me. But sometimes we just have to make deals and it's just like, okay, I need 2 hours, go do your thing. I'm sure you can relate with that. So
I
that's kind of
totally
how
can.
I'm trying to juggle life. I know it's not really a strategy. Whatever works for me, really. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Thank
I,
you.
I
Thank
feel
you,
like
Gail.
I feel like it's a mindset. I feel like if I have my goals set for like each month or each week or each day, and as long as I accomplish them, doesn't matter when exactly I do them.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. And I really appreciate that you asked that question to guests sometimes on your podcast because I feel like, yeah, it's such a tricky thing and everyone's just, doing their best to make it work. And I totally agree with you where having a 9-year-old, I'm recognizing too that, we're close to a time where she will be doing more of her own thing. And then, that's maybe more of a time for me to focus more on work and really trying to embrace this last bit of time where she does want to spend time with me as well. So I
Exactly.
completely get that. And I think too, like we talked about how like women's health is underfunded, under research. I feel like this conversation, it's happening more and more, but I think that it's important for us to continue to have this conversation and to talk about this to kind of normalize that as well, the struggle of being a working parent and a working mother and trying to balance it all. So I'm glad that you continue to ask people that and that I asked it back to you and you answered it.
Yeah, I know. I think it's really important to not get that burnout out because I know a lot of people, especially in the nonprofit area, really involved, really passionate about what they do. That sometimes it's hard for them to do it all, really. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time with us today because I know how time is really important for everyone, right? And thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing your insights. I appreciate your honesty, your perspective on what it means to communicate with both strategy and heart. So if today's conversation resonated with the listener, like anyone out there, I would love it if you can share this episode with someone working in a nonprofit or purpose-driven space. Share Kendra stories, and it will really help other people to discover the nonprofit organizations and the strategies behind their work and how much heart everyone put into what they do. So you can learn more about Calgary Health Foundation at calgaryhealthfoundation.ca. Also put the link in the show notes and maybe the link to connect with Kendra personally, if that's okay.
Yep.
And if you enjoy Buddha stories, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And that's a wrap on another Buddha story. Until next time, keep making stories worth sharing. Bye.